This is New Patreon Series number 81. We're going to talk about how ancient traditions of returning blessings to God developed into the American Thanksgiving holiday. Let's look at the Pharaonic Nile Rite. Each year at the inundation of the Nile, the pharaoh performed a ritual that symbolized returning grace, that is, expressing gratitude by sharing or gifting to others, to the god of the Nile. The Egyptian government took a portion of each farmer's crop, fecundated by the black silt of the Nile, and distributed it equally to citizens with a failed crop, or whose work or craftsman activities for the pharaoh left them with very little food. In the ritual, he masturbated into the river and then was joined by other Egyptian nobles who also masturbated. Here you can see the evidence of that in this carving. Here's a reference to it if you want to check it out. The pharaoh then sang this hymn to the Nile. O inundation of the Nile, offerings are made unto you, men are immolated to you, great festivals are instituted for you, birds are sacrificed to you, gazelles are taken for you in the mountain, pure flames are prepared for you, sacrifices given to every god as it is made to the Nile. The Nile has made its retreats in southern Egypt. Its name is not known beyond the tomb of Tau, which is the pyramid tomb of the pharaoh Tau and his wife Yuwa. The god, being the Nile, manifests not his forms or his origins. He baffles all conceptions. You can check that information on the source. This was a primitive symbol of returning grace to God, which would be Ta, from whom the Nile emerged. And this is probably the earliest form of an organized giving of thanks or thanksgiving, although there may have been others. Now let's take a look at the ancient Babylonian, Greek, Roman, Hebrew, and Jewish forms of returning grace with a meal. In the old Babylonian period, which is about 2000 to 1600 before the Christian era, living relatives would leave food at the graves of the dead at the same time each month. If an offering was late or forgotten, the ghosts would return to the earth in search of sustenance, causing harm or misfortune to the living. Feeding ghosts was not only a means of protection, but also of sharing or returning grace. Here we have a painting on an urn showing the ritual of leaving food at the graves of the dead. In the ancient Greek anagismata, fruit, grain, and animal offerings made at the tombs of the deceased was done for the same reasons. In the later Greek agape meals or love feasts, where people gathered on a date each year after a loved one had died, the meal was supposed to be shared equally. The clue was sharing. However, Paul rebuked the Corinthian agape, which he reformed as the solemn Eucharist. In 1 Corinthians, he says, Now then, when you come together, it is not the Lord's supper you eat, for as you eat, each of you goes ahead without sharing his meal. And that's the part I want to emphasize, sharing. While one remains hungry, another gets drunk. Don't you have your own homes in which to eat and drink, or do you despise the church of God and humiliate those who have nothing? What can I say to you? Shall I praise you for this? No, I will not. Now the Hebrew Shiva meal was the first meal which should be eaten after the funeral. It is still known as the Sudat Havara, or the meal of comforting, with a formal thanksgiving offered to God. The Roma Cena Novendialis was a feast of comfort, sharing, and protection from ghosts. We want to reference the Southern Baptist funeral wake, where community itself brings food for comfort and sharing. The Jewish Pesach, or Passover, was and continues to be a gathering of family and friends, with thanksgivings offered to God in the form Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. Blessed art thou, Lord, our God and ruler of all being. So let's look at Yeshua's meal blessings. Yeshua, like most observant Jews, undoubtedly offered the Kiddush prayer for Pesach over the wine and bread many times before the gospel event known as the last Passover. The Kiddush was later observed by the disciples as a special rite in the Todah. Some scholars have doubted the biblical story of the institution of the Eucharist, that it was historical. But, quote, an increasing number of scholars has reasserted the historicity of the institution of the Eucharist, reinterpreting it from a Jewish eschatological point of view. I'm quoting, according to Lutheran theologian Joachim Jeremias, for example, the Last Supper should be seen as a climax of a series of messianic meals held by Jesus in anticipation of a new Exodus. Similar views are echoed in more recent works by Catholic biblical scholars such as Meyer and Petra and the Anglican scholar Wright. So we should say something about the Apostolic Todah, or the Eucharist. After Yeshua's crucifixion, the disciples continued to meet in Capernaum for a Todah, or Thanksgiving meal, in which Peter recorded their remembrances of his sayings and parables, and saw visions of the risen Jesus, or Christ. In Jesus' day, the Greek word that would best translate the Hebrew word Todah was Eucharistia, which also means thanksgiving. You can find this information at the reference I put on the screen. The Todah for communion with the risen Christ was taken to Asia Minor, where it was practiced as an agape meal and later reformed by Paul, become what we know as the Mass or the Eucharist. So Paul's reformed Eucharist spread to all the Christian communities around the Mediterranean, and by the end of the century had formed the basis for the Christian Mass. It goes to Italy and to Sicily, and all places where the Todah showed up as a Eucharist. So let's look at the influence of communion and Eucharist on the Western holidays. Masses were said using special vestments for the Nativity, which became Christmas, and Lent and Good Friday and Easter and Pentecost and others. The focus was on divine communion, eating Christ's body and blood, or prayers for a good harvest, as in the harvest festival of the autumnal equinox. The most relevant influence of communion on the Western holidays was the Feast of St. Martin, or Martin Mass, on November 11th. For most of the European continent, Martin Mass was the biggest and final fall harvest feast. The festivities were in gratitude and joy for the wine harvest and the great winter slaughter of animals. Just as in the Todah, centered on a large bird representing the freedom of flight, the feasting usually centered around a Martin Mass goose accompanied with apples. In Europe, Christmas dinners often centered around a roast turkey. So here's how the American holiday of Thanksgiving was established. On September 28, 1789, just before leaving for recess, the first federal Congress passed a resolution asking that the President of the United States recommend to the nation a day of Thanksgiving. A few days later, President George Washington issued a proclamation naming Thursday, November 26, 1789, as a day of public Thanksgiving, the first time Thanksgiving was celebrated under the new Constitution. Constitution. And here I put up a little picture of the Thanksgiving resolution that Washington made. In 1863, Sarah Josepha Hale, who was a descendant of the composer of the American National Anthem, campaigned to formalize a day of Thanksgiving. She published magazine articles on the subject and sent correspondence to President Lincoln and to every governor of the U.S. state and territories. And she wrote to Lincoln, "Would it not be fitting and patriotic to appeal to the governors of all the states, inviting and commending those to unite in issuing proclamations for the last Thursday in November as the day of Thanksgiving for the people of each state?" It wasn't until President Abraham Lincoln's 1863 proclamation that Thanksgiving was regularly commemorated each year on the last Thursday of November. A turkey, once proposed by Franklin to be the national bird, was the meal of choice. Now, Tad, Lincoln's son, was born with a cleft palate and developed compassion for others as a result of his own misfortune. So when a turkey was about to be slaughtered for dinner, he begged his father to set it free. President Lincoln wrote a pardon and had the turkey released. The presidential turkey pardon continues today as a White House media event, but the president still eats a traditional turkey on Thanksgiving. There's a photograph of President Lincoln with his son, Tad. So Thanksgiving was an ancient American tradition that was incorporated into the founding of the American colonies by George Washington and proclaimed a national holiday by Abraham Lincoln. Please click on the Patreon link in my description just below the video to become a patron, helping to sponsor my new videos on the pre-Christian teachings of Yeshua and other relevant topics.